Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on the PABS negotiations. My name is Spring Gombe. I'm the founding partner of the Policy Strategy Academy. And we have initiated this series because we feel it is very, very important for African business, African research, African academia to understand the implications of the pandemic treaty we should enter into force next year, and to make preparations in anticipation of the entry into force of the pandemic treaty for their business and for their practice. We welcome all those who are also following this from a technical perspective as negotiators, as diplomats themselves. Thank you for joining the call. The second briefing is the first in which we will actually get into the meat of what is being discussed in the PABS Annex. As those of you who attended our first briefing will recall, the two negotiators from the Africa region informed us that really the treaty will stand or fall on what is discussed in this annex, because it goes directly to the heart of sharing of the pathogens that might be responsible for future pandemics in order that countermeasures can be rapidly produced and ultimately in order that all of us everywhere are safe. I am very, very pleased to be joined for this discussion by two eminent experts, Thiru Balasubramaniam, who is the Geneva representative of Knowledge in Ecology International. And as those of you who are familiar with Geneva will know, a mainstay of the diplomatic discussions around health, access to health, and innovation. And also joined by Dr. Gertrude Mothibe from the Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations. Gertrude, very pleased to have you with us as you bring to us the perspective and the import for African industry of the pandemic agreement, especially in the context of the new public health order and the ambitions of the African continent for local manufacturing. So where are we? We have a text for the pandemic treaty negotiations. It is detailed, it is complex, and Thiru will walk us through it. And then we have a new development, the United States, which has opted out of the pandemic treaty and indeed out of the WHO. It will officially leave on January 26 next year, has initiated a parallel process on the African continent of bilateral agreements that it wishes to see concluded with a number of countries in respect of its own access to to pathogens and surveillance and any benefits that might accrue to the African continent as a consequence. And so at this very critical moment, we want to lay out what is at stake. We hope that this will be a dynamic discussion. We will first hear from Thiru, and then I will ask Gertrude a number of questions and then open it to the entire audience for your own questions or observations. So Thiru, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Spring, and I'm glad to be able to participate. And just before I dive in, yes, as you know, I will do the brief as you instructed me, but I'll go into a little bit and give you a flavor of the IGWIG negotiations that took place last week, but also go into a bit of detail in relation to one important aspect, that is intellectual property, but also a very specific issue on basically voluntary licensing on mutually agreed terms, which basically was part of a long discussion underpinning Article 11 of the Pandemic Treaty. And I would say that it will still play a bit. So I'll just start off. So At the beginning of the week, last week, the Bureau had prepared a draft text of the Pathogen Access and Benefit-Sharing Annex, which was 7 pages long. And at the beginning of last week, because as a group in official relations, we had, we got to speak as did many other relevant stakeholders. And, in relation to the text, we basically said to the membership that they should indeed retain footnote 1 in the text, which we'll show later, on technology transfer, which refers to footnote 8 of the pandemic treaty text. And I'll read this out quite slowly, and we can go back and discuss this. But it basically says, footnote 8, or it says, for the purposes of the WHO pandemic agreement, as mutually agreed, that's in quotes, means willingly undertaken and on mutually agreed terms without prejudice to the rights and obligations of the parties under other international agreements, end quote. And so for just background, I'd like to take a bit of a deep dive into the evolution of this, which in this framing came at the 11th, literally in a sense, the 11th hour of the April pandemic treaty negotiations. So basically, at the end stage in April, the delegation of Brazil had introduced language which more or less resembles what I just read out. Now, our group, KEI, had this consistent position that we want, and others wanted, any reference to voluntary or mutually agreed terms to be deleted. And then basically, I would say the northern pharmaceutical industry wanted technology transfer defined as the product of a mutually agreed process. So the important aspect of what Brazil suggested was that what was agreed was not without prejudice to other flexibilities that countries could take in international agreements, such as TRIPS flexibilities. So then I'll just go on a bit in terms of providing you more background of what we said last week. Going back to the initial 7-page Bureau text, there was a requirement in the text that said commitments undertaken by each participating manufacturer in the PABS contract shall be made publicly available by WHO. We said it's welcome, but frankly, insufficient in regards to transparency. We said the full text of the PABS contracts should be published and require that prices, quantities, and revenues of products be published on a WHO website. And we also flagged that the WHO Transparency Resolution 72.8 should be included by reference. And given the, in the pandemic response, given the history of price gouging and inequality, obligating manufacturers to provide access to health-related products is regrettably vague. And then we pointed out to very specific language, actually from this year, from the European Union's Health Data Space Regulation, paragraph 61, and I'll read it by quoting, "The use of health data for research and development purposes shall contribute to benefiting society in the form of new medicines, medical devices, and healthcare products and services at affordable and fair prices for union citizens, as well as enhancing access to and the availability of such products and services in all member states," meaning of the European Union. And at affordable and fair prices is separate obligation for mere access or availability. Now I'll go into a bit of the modalities for the IGWIG process, which I think is quite relevant, perhaps for this audience here. At the end of the second IGWIG meeting in September, the report of the meeting made a proposal which was subject to further consideration, but at the time it was really welcomed by groups such as ours, that basically Bureau would invite relevant stakeholders to observe the discussions of the IGWIG 3 as a pilot, including the drafting group, basically. However, a few countries still have objections, so we could not observe the actual discussions of the text, because actually, to add some precision, as I understand, there still weren't really text-based negotiations or a drafting group. It was more like a read through the Bureau text. And I would say this, that earlier I mentioned that it's 7 pages and it was more or less easy to wade through. Now it's expanded to 29 pages. And the thing is, the length is not the issue, but you basically have all kinds of annotations, and it's hard to really make sense of this. And we can put the text up, and then just more in the issue on transparency itself. We would still maintain that given the significant attacks on the WHO and the importance of restoring and improving the public's trust in the institution and in the treaty, we would strongly urge the WHO member states to embrace more open and transparent rules for conducting the negotiations. And if I have time, I would like to just show the text and then to give you examples of things. So yeah, if you could please, whoever's handling, like monitoring that, if you could do a word search for the word license, but if you could you spell it in the British way? So it's 2 C's, so no S, so LICNCE. And if I'm not mistaken, there should be 2 references. Right? Yeah. So exactly. So if you can go there and maybe, I don't know if you can like increase the font. Yeah, exactly. So that's one indication of, and we can stare at that a little bit. That's one reference to license. And then the second, could we look at, or I guess it is so. And then just to give you an example, we'll change it a little bit and put in the phrase or the word licensing. So LICENSING. So there are 3 references to licensing. And then license in the American way with an S, there should be 10 references. But the point is, if you look, I mean, you don't, like, we just look here for now. If you look at these options and paragraphs, it is true that based on the type of language proposed, one could, have a guessing game about what type of delegation would make such a proposal. But it's really not, it's still, for all of us to really, examine the text and just, report back to our constituents or your companies or governments. Well, I guess for some, you sort of know, but even if you were part of the discussions, actually, not having annotation, it's, I can see why they did it, but it's still, I would just make the point that it won't be an easy process. And I think I can end now, but I think Spring, you feel free to share this to your participants, and then you can see for yourself on any given subject of interest on access and benefit sharing, technology transfer, how complex the text has become. So I think I would say for now I'm over, but I would be happy to participate in a discussion after. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thiru. Yeah, it looks very, very complex, and it's has huge implications for you, Gertrude, as the industry. We can see that all of this language about licensing is about commitment or obligations that will be exercised upon you. Thiru has mentioned that they, as a civil society organization, do want to see strong commitments on your part. There's some back and forth about that. There is a need for transparency, but there is also a need for clarity. So, Gertrude, maybe we can bring in your perspective from the African pharmaceutical manufacturing associations. You're following the PABS, you're following it closely. Why does it matter now? And what are you doing in advance of a potential mid-2026 entry into force to get your members ready and to contribute to the negotiation process?
Thank you very much, Spring, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting FAPMA to this session. And I am very pleased, seriously, and listening to Thiru. I'm glad that FAPMA is here because these are the kind of conversations that we need to have together and not read about it in complex reports. So before I answer your question, let me just lay a ground for those that may not be familiar with FAPMA in just a minute. Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association comprises 3 advocacy groups from Southern region of Africa, from the West and from the East, and these 3 groups form FAPMA. And critical, I want to underscore this, FAPMA was launched in Addis Ababa under the auspices of African Union in 2013. Why do I want to underscore this? From what we had from that first presentation, we need to understand that FAPMA, as an advocacy group, a continental advocacy group now, taking care of the generic manufacturers in the continent, we work closely with African Union. All African Union agreements, documents, we are called in to look at them before they are signed up, okay? So having given that foundation, coherence, what do we say to this, and the documents that are written. I like the way you said it's an intense document and small print, because sometimes we are happy to accept a signed document, but when you look at it, when it comes to implementation, it does not talk to what you wanted. Just a case in point, I won't go into details. If we think of the TRIPS flexibilities, that was a great thing for the developing, underdeveloped countries, but you haven't heard of any company that has used TRIPS flexibilities, because when it came to small prints, it was not benefiting the companies nor the countries where it was supposed to be implemented. So, under the auspices of African Union, work with African Union, we want and are very keen to discuss documents and agreements that build on what the African Union has been building on from its inception. And recently we've had the African Free Continental Trade Agreement, which now opens out trade from Cape to Cairo in the continent. We have had the recent new new health order, right? Public order, pardon me. So in those, the developments of those were done with interested, with the current stakeholders, and FAPMA being one of them. We are aware and we were talking coherence there. So any other agreement that we have going forward, when we look at it, and we're really here, ready to look at it, we're ready and willing to be part of it. We've been following what's been happening, and recently we find that mid-2026 is going to have the takeoff. Now, in industry, that's 7 months away. In industry, 7 months is like just 7 minutes, because the preparation has to happen years before, and the preparation for being ready to implement what it will be talking to us about has to be like now. So we would like to know that in that document, it provides coherence, it provides alignment to the documents that are already there. It provides for benefiting companies and countries and populations of Africa in an understood, committed way. There's so much I could say, Spring and the other people. Please ask more. Please ask your question.
Okay, so let me do that. Let me get as specific as I can. As you know, yes, in the negotiations right now, there is a question of set-asides and supply commitments, right? So that will implicate all companies. Thiru has pointed out that the debate continues, but do you see set-asides as an opportunity for you, or are they a liability?
Both, but more opportunities. And set-asides are a big opportunity in the sense that what I've said about the preparation and the planning, pharmaceutical industry is works on economies of scale, right? You need to have huge numbers in order for you to be able to plan properly, in order for you to be profitable. And believe you me, contrary to common belief, companies, manufacturing companies, have to be profitable in order to be viable and sustainable. So the larger the numbers, the better for economies of scale. But not just that, you need to know what you're going to be preparing. You need to know when it will be needed. You need to know that there are off-takes that are realistic and binding. So in the clauses, in that small print table, there have to be clauses that are binding, not wishes and hopes. So set-asides, from what the documents are saying now, we had to read it very, very quickly. And really, we had to dig in, because we would want to bless something which in a year's time you find us pulling back because it doesn't work for us. So set-asides will give us the identity of what is going to be needed, the numbers that are going to be needed, and the when. And in terms of the numbers, let us have committed takeoffs. I would want to say legally committing, but I don't know if that can be put in there. But when you say committing, such that companies can plan, and not just planning. I talked of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement that opens trade up and down the whole continent. So if a company is planning to manufacture part of the VGTs, the vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, if it's planning to do one of those or a few of those, they need to know their numbers. They need to plan. They need to have the investors. They need to have the tech partners way ahead, at least a year ahead. So at least if they start that planning based on data, reliable data, and committed data, that's a positive. But the liability is that.
Mm-hmm. Please go ahead. Yeah.
The liability is, I said more of the positive. The liability is that if there be a change after you start putting into place, say, upgrading a facility or building a new facility, because your current facility cannot legally carry out what you want to manufacture. After you start doing that, then there's a change of policy. That is such a risk and becomes a liability. I could give examples, but let me just see how time goes. I've got real living examples of companies either went out, some were closed because of that. Some had to really reduce their work because of that. But
thanks, Gertrude. So
I have time to give some examples.
Yeah, that's really that was very clear. I think one of the things that this throws into relief is that you need a lot of predictability And you need
Yes.
and you need there's a very nice German expression. They say consequent bleiben, and you need people to stay the course once a decision has been taken. So here you are. The negotiations are taking place. Countries are going to try and position themselves and hopefully provide you with their clarity. And then we hear parallel mechanisms are now underway, and bilateral offers are being made to individual governments. So does that introduce an additional element of risk? And what would you like to say on that to both African governments and the bilateral partners?
Huge risk, colleagues. And in fact, this is where, let me use the examples that I have to give clarity of the huge risks. We have had pandemics with HIV, or we have, okay, but now it's managed. We had COVID and on the HIV and parallel agreements. When the ARVs were developed and countries and companies that were willing for tech transfer came up, one of our companies in Zimbabwe came up and said, yes, we're willing, we've got the capacity, we've got the intellectual capacity. And they went into huge investment. But with the government approval, their government approval, right? With their government blessing, right? And their regulatory blessing, they went into huge agreement, into huge investment. And as they started ordering the inputs, somebody whispered to the ear of the government of a better way of treating HIV in Zimbabwe, a better way of manufacturing. And after blessing this company, let me mention it because it's public, Barricade, the government took away from their list of products that they would buy the very product that they were manufacturing, right? Because somebody said, use another product and it's going to come with donations. And Barricade was left with, what do you call it in English? White elephant, right? Because where they were going to manufacture this ARV, they were not ready to manufacture other things. They just survived by the skin of the teeth, right? Because government now switched and agreed to use other products, ARVs, and Barricade was left with this white elephant. And another example, COVID, we had the issue of aspirin in South Africa, whereby by agreement, they started manufacturing vaccines. But when they finished vaccines, there was a shift from even what the company understood. The very company that was manufacturing for Africa, but there was a different understanding, which now, where comes in small print and agreements, and that's why I said commitment, that can be turned to legal commitment. And the last one, a very tragic one, in Namibia, a company called Dore, during the HIV, okay, we still have got HIV pandemic. We're so used to it that we keep on thinking of it as if it's past. But they went into investment into condom manufacture as FAPMA. We went to see them and to bless them and to really talk about this as a great example. They had an agreement with Namibia that the government is going to buy from Dore. Somebody whispered into the ear of government to change where they order from, how they order. And Dore was left with millions of condoms with no customer, with no procurement. And unfortunately, Dore went under and the company is closed. So parallel agreements are disastrous, not can be, they are disastrous to industry. And when we look at documents now, we look at if there are clauses that can actually protect that. Because like I said, companies have to be viable, and it's for the benefit not just of industry, but for communities. When Dore went under, economy of Namibia, employees, and the condoms, now they're importing them not at a cheaper price. So communities, governments, industry suffers when companies go under. That's the big risk.
Thanks, Gertrude. That was very, very clearly articulated. Thiru, maybe I can bring you in here, because how then should we position, or how should negotiators position to take account of these parallel initiatives that, this week will be underway with whistle-stop tours to various African capitals.
Yeah, thank you, Spring, and thank you, Gertrude. It's really nice to meet you as well. You know, I came to really, yeah, like I think all of us, or maybe some probably knew before, but at least many of us only found out, or I'll speak for myself, we found out about this specific memo on early Friday morning when Health Policy Watch published an article, and that was followed by various other important journals, including Geneva Health Files. Then Reuters published something on it, as did Bloomberg. So a lot of eyes were on it. And I would, just to give you some perspective, at the opening session on Friday morning, actually, Dr. Michel Kazachkin with the Independent Preparedness Panel, he was also representing the Right Honorable Helen Clark, who's now she'll be the, I guess, yeah, chair of Gavi. And you might also remember him as the former executive director of Global Fund. Anyway, he specifically addressed this without, let's say, naming a country, but he basically, he was quite clear, and he was quoted in many of these articles, saying that this parallel process would undermine what was, you know, at stake at the heart of these multilateral discussions in Geneva that would have consequences on the world. And you know, I also, Spring, you know, thanks for, you shared Emily Bass's Substack, and I was thinking that in terms of the schedule, it's this very assiduous full court press type of thing. But I was wondering, I guess it's done by the State Department, but I was just wondering, you know, given the current state of where things are in the US in terms of, you know, people having jobs, et cetera, I wonder who would be the actual, let's say, boots on the ground. I guess they would, you know, maybe use some of the people at their missions. But then I would like to switch tracks just a little bit and just mention another recent development, which I only heard of yesterday, and this was in the context of the WTO TRIPS Council, and I was at a side event. But before that, a delegate told me that on the WTO side, that the UK delegation, basically, they haven't submitted anything formally yet, but apparently they're diligently working on some sort of proposal or paper. I don't know what form it'll take, but something on exactly what I was, you know, I gave a sort of deep dive into before, on voluntary and mutually agreed terms, basically voluntary licensing. And the delegate told me, you know, they basically want to, you know, improve discussion, you know, the nature of it. But I myself haven't seen this, but I'm just hinting that one could see it, you know, maybe it'll be released in some forum at the WTO, but it could move up the hill. And I'll just end soon, but just one other thing, one observation from this delegate from a developing country. They said that in the UK proposal, that there were basically a lot of requirements on the, let's say, recipient countries, but there was like almost nothing, or nada, like nothing on the other side of the coin. So and then, you know, the UK acknowledged that, but let's see how things turn out. But I just thought, because I think that also has a lot of ramifications for the manufacturers that you know, Gertrude represents, among others.
Thanks very much, Thiru. So what it seems like is now that there is that one party has started pursuing bilateral channels. Others are now not only pursuing bilateral channels, but are also using other fora. And this was one of the dangers that was pointed out earlier this year, that should the multilateral process and the attacks on the WHO persist, as you mentioned in your earlier statements, the danger is that people or entities can now choose the fora which they will feel are most amenable to their interests and try to push through their interests there. Perhaps you can tell us from previous experience how best stakeholders can deal with the question of forum shopping, and how the WTO relates to WHO, relates to WIPO, and yeah.
Yeah, actually, so I mentioned that yesterday and today are like proceedings of a formal body at the WTO, the TRIPS Council, which basically oversees the agreement which deals with intellectual property, which is a binding part of the WTO. But basically, there was a side event yesterday, co-sponsored by a number of countries. I would say 6, and they are all high-income countries: Japan, U.S., UK, Switzerland, Korea, and the European Union. And it was on technology transfer. But basically, I would say that they had speakers, including from WIPO, Gilead, and then an academic from the UK. But it's almost, I mean, there are 3 different organizations. And by the way, it was an all-male panel, and they all happened to be, there was no person of color as well. So I'll just leave it there. But they were all, I would say, singing from the same hymn sheet. And the focus was really on voluntary approaches. Now, just to be clear, as KI, we are supportive of voluntary measures as the full suite of access options. And, we think actually incentives for companies, to engage in voluntary licensing is quite important. But it was just, personally, I just found some of the academic discussions. I mean, I actually thought that the company speaker was more direct, and I thought, but I would say also this, that it was really well attended because it's a side event; it's not some mandatory thing, and there were, at least between 80 to 100 people, a lot of industry. But I also saw at least 2 WHO negotiators who dealt with the pandemic treaty, and also PABS. They were there. So, and I mentioned the UK, and they were one of the co-sponsors of the event, and they did ask, a question to the panelists. So, but let's just say this: I think probably many countries, or especially the high-income ones, are quite coordinated, even if they have different ministries. I mean, everyone has different ministries dealing with different issues, but I would say that there are people, they talk, they coordinate well. And I would just, I think it's served developing countries well in the last 25 years, in this intersection of health and trade. I would say in the same way that, let's say, high-income delegations coordinate well between their ministries of finance, trade, justice, intellectual property, health. I think, not to say that our countries, developing countries, don't, but there's a huge level of coordination. Actually, on like, just in a different context, not at the formal IGWIG PABS, but there was an informal IGWIG meeting with experts in October, and parts of it, that meeting in October, we got to listen in. And I will say this: I was actually quite impressed with many African member states. In that sense, I actually, because as I said, most of the time you only see the official statements. You don't actually see when they get into the technical nitty-gritty. And I was very impressed by what I saw. Look, there was actually, not coming to think of it in these technical discussions, there was a large level of what I would maybe look like coordination to me. And I would say, keep it up.
Thanks, Thiru. That's very clear. So there needs to be coordination across ministries. There needs to be attention to all the fora that may influence the outcomes of the treaty or may be implicated in the outcomes of the treaty. And there needs to be some kind of coordination between presumably what's happening in Geneva and then what's happening at home. So let's go back to the question of what do your members need to meet this moment where now it's very complex? The negotiations in themselves are complex, but now you're also going to need to be coordinated across multiple fora. What do you need? What should you be providing them?
Thank you very much. Critical to industry and therefore to all our members is data, reliable data, reliable data. When we talked of set-asides, we're looking at the documents from PABS and looking at the different elements of the documents. We believe the set-asides actually talk to the work of the industry most, right? What do we need in the next 7 months across the different negotiating bodies is transparency, yeah? Because like Thiru was saying about what the British were saying about we want to improve. Transparency as to what are you improving against what and why. I talked of the African Union, the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, and then the new Public Health Order for Africa. These build on each other for the benefit of the African communities. So any other added agreement, we are cognizant of the fact that no continent, no person works in isolation. Therefore, we acknowledge the discussion and that negotiations that they have to be across different bodies, different countries, different economies. But in that negotiation, there has to be transparency, because there we or anybody picks up that there is no transparency, there's distrust, people back off. Yeah. So what you need is data, reliable data, transparency, and commitment to coherence, and not to break up what has been agreed. Nothing should disentangle what the new Public Health Order for Africa has done. Those 5 pillars stand because they were built on what the people needed, what industry needed. We, the companies, the members, will need to talk to their own home finances, right? So it has to be on the numbers. This is coming up. This is going to be agreed. This is going to take off in about 7 months. And we have been trying to get investment, but for such investment, it would be good to have domestic investment, which is embedded in the new Public Health Order for Africa. So to do that, you go to your local finance body, say central bank, with clear numbers, because if you go there with something that is not clear, you lose trust, government doesn't support you. And this is where the African farmer fails to grow, because it has, in the main, it has not had really the correct, reliable data. Thank you.
Okay, clear. So it's not clear to me that the negotiations themselves can provide that data right now. I think it will require coordination with other entities in order to achieve that. But that's an important point to take forward. It speaks to bankability, right, of the efforts that are being undertaken by industry. See, we have about 15 minutes left in the call, and I'd like to bring in the audience with any questions if they have them. Excuse me. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and then we will come to you.
And if need be, you may open the video since the audience is going to come in.
Sure. Colleagues, any questions? None? It's all perfectly clear.
While they're thinking of raising their hand, one more point about what the companies need. You know, when you talk of trust, there's the written documents that come in small print, and you're fishing for what these clauses mean. But there's also an advantage in meeting physically. So maybe in one of these negotiations, if FAPMA can also be called in to listen in, to get the body language, to look at documents and ask the deep questions that maybe on paper you don't put it down because then you've got to train there. But that is something that has worked in the past. African Union does that well. Whenever they've got a new agreement to be set up, they'll call FAPMA physically. So we're there to discuss. And our regulators right across the continent, we are partners. We are observers in most of their changes of regulation, and some of their documents they pass through the advocacy groups so that we can look at them, that they do serve the industry and the continent. So if it's possible, a physical, just maybe one-off meeting before the 7 months is up, that would be absolutely beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you. Clear call. Shanad, I see you have a question. Shanad Mazangera from DNDI in Nairobi. If you're speaking, Shanad, we cannot hear you. Oh, now you should be unmuted.
Okay,
Try again.
Yes, yeah.
Try again.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I didn't see the mic. Yeah. So thank you for an insightful discussion and a lot of points. But I have one question on the issue of these parallel agreements that the US and maybe even other countries will try to get into. I'm not clear then what should happen, because I have already seen the list of initial countries where these agreements or where a pilot of these agreements will be done. But I mean, what are you saying to these countries if the US or another big country approaches and says we want to have this para agreement, and yet we are trying to have a multilateral discussion under the pandemic agreement? So what is the advice to countries in those circumstances? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shanad. Maybe, Thiru, let me go to you first from the perspective of the negotiations, and then Gertrude, to you from the perspective of industry, what you are saying to countries.
Yeah.
So I think on this, thank you, Shanad, for this very timely question. You know, I've looked at some of what some other experts, such as Ngozi and Dr. FIFA Rahman, have said, and I would agree that, you know, with them in the sense that each country should, you know, one shouldn't treat this as a fait accompli, but one should really go into this as a negotiation because it's not, they also need something, right? So I wouldn't, you know, I would treat this very seriously, but, you know, like one, you know, you have leverage. So, you know, I guess you should treat it like any other negotiation. But to your question about how, yeah, this relates to the pandemic agreement, I think, I think I would say many countries are still a bit, they were surprised by it. And actually, on a broader point, I would just say, you know, I was thinking, reflecting on this news about these bilateral measures and memos, and it reminded me more or less of the situation, you know, that many of us were in 25 years ago, in the early days of the HIV response. And let's say before, you know, even global institutions such as the Global Fund or PEPFAR were started. And that only really came into being because of activists, including my boss, Jamie Love, but many others, including the good folks at MSF in terms of facilitating access to generic HIV. But before, there was this, let's say, inflection point when there was a lot of conflict in terms of the mandates of different ministries and organizations, and at that time there was it was a great series done by the Washington Post by this reporter called Barton Gellman, who left the paper subsequently, like many years later, but he actually got 3 Pulitzers for reporting on national security. But I'll send the links to Spring and her team, but I really, because I think these links are still open access, and they're really, because what it shows, I mean, there are 3 stories, 3 separate articles, and the second one really focuses on the multilateral pressures that brought to bear against institutions like UNAIDS and WHO. And the article, I mean, he really has the receipts. He really shows how big companies, Merck, you name it, Glaxo, BMS, they leaned in. They had identified targets such as the Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and they felt that they would really bring pressure to bear on some sort of, I mean, they still wanted to, it was couched in perhaps similar ways that we want to work together to have access, but then they had all these conditionalities on don't mention price, or certainly on intellectual property. And the article even says these CEOs, they sought to exploit the divisions between WHO and UNAIDS at the time, so divida et impera. And it's quite a remarkable piece, because it starts off with basically this CEO at the time of Merck called Raymond Gilmartin flying in private jet with only 4 hours of sleep, going to an unmarked room, or a room with a number, but it was on no agenda, it was a private meeting. And it is quite remarkable, the level of pressure brought to bear. And there's even a bit later on where it talks about approaching Kofi Annan, and I guess either James Wolfenson, and it said, it just gave this line saying, oh, because they had, their Swedish-born wives were friends with each other. Anyway, sorry, I went off a bit, but these bilateral pressures remind me a little bit of what some, huge multinationals did at a very critical point in these access fights. Thank you.
So we learn from history, and so we'll share those documents with everybody for your edification. Gertrude, from the perspective of FAPMA.
Thank you. And I endorse what Thiru said about this. A brilliant question and very timely. And let me write on what Thiru said in very wise words, Thiru. Everybody is everybody. I do wish the negotiators, even as the negotiations now are coming to a head, I wish them all the wisdom and all the courage to remember that everybody needs everybody. Whatever the other party brings on the table that sounds so lucrative and make you look weak, everybody needs everybody. And this continent has the bigger advantage that it's the youngest continent. It's got a very young population, yet most of these pathogens, which is what brings us to this meeting, most of these pathogens are rampant in Africa. So when it comes to pathogen access, when it comes to business, players are going to focus mostly on Africa. So that should give the negotiators for Africa the strength, without fighting, without sounding rude, but you stand your ground. That this is what we want. We want coherence. We want transparency. We have picked that this phrase and that phrase does not align with our African Union phrases like this. We don't agree with this. If people say we'll walk, well, that's very unfortunate. But if you walk, you don't have access to our pathogens. Africa has to be that strong. And just in half a minute, just an example. Negotiation requires that you are strong, even if the other party makes you feel like you're going to lose. If you've got all your data right, if you've got all your facts right, and you know your strength, stand strong. Because the other party may threaten to walk away, but they don't really mean it. They're just going away to renegotiate how they approach you. An example, Global Fund, one of maybe the biggest procurer, especially in pandemic areas. In 2018, FAPMA went to the Global Fund offices in Geneva to go and negotiate production of the non-pandemic medicines by FAPMA. It's a long story, but the negotiations, the way we planned it, we even had to say, you say this, you go quiet when it's this, your voice is small. It had to be a very planned negotiating system, but we didn't get very far. We pushed, we didn't relent. And this year, May 2025, 6.5 years later, because we went in September, one of our members in Kenya is now supplying Global Fund. Finally, we got part of what we wanted, but we didn't relent. And that's what, in answer to your questions, what do you do? Get the confidence and the conviction that what you're negotiating on, you believe in, but you negotiate. And if you feel you're being cheated, don't give in what would otherwise disentangle what you already have. Do not. And finally, you will get something. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really excellent point in which to close this meeting. I hope that this webinar has proved useful for those who are here, and that it'll also prove useful to those who hear the recording later, in terms of supporting them in their strategic approach to the negotiations, but to also the raison d'etre of the negotiations, to what comes next, for access to countermeasures for pandemics for all people everywhere. Thiru, Gertrude, thank you for your candid interventions, full of color, full of examples, full of history from which we can learn. Thank you for those who listened, and for the question from you, Shenard. We hope to continue, we will continue this series with a third meeting, a third webinar, immediately following the next formal round of the IGWIG, which is the week of December 1 to 5. So please look out for an invitation to our next webinar to follow that. The Policy Strategy Academy is also offering a course for those who'd be interested in getting into the detail of how to implement, with 3 experts from the African continent who have guided us through multiple negotiations, including the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and all of the work that led up to the pandemic treaty. So do look out for that as well. Thank you all for your time. I think we will be able to finish right at 10, and we will look forward to seeing you again another time. Bye.
Thank you very much, Spray, for organizing.
Thank you. Thank you.